Hello everybody, I'd like to welcome you to our 20th video in the pre-algebra playlist, and in this video we're going to go over the concept of adding and subtracting decimals. Now before we add and subtract decimals and do a few examples of those, let's just do a quick review of adding integers and then subtracting basic integers. So if I have something such as 1, 2, 3, 4 plus 5, 6, 7, 8, then all I need to do is line up all the digits together like this over here. All the units digits go on top of one another. All the tens digit go on top of one another, and so on and so on. And then all I do is that I simply add up the columns. So 4 plus 8 gives me a 12. And now I need to carry over the tens place number on top of the next number and write down the units number right below the units column. So I have 12 like this over here. Next, I add up this entire column over here. So 3 plus 1 gives me a 4, and 4 plus 7 gives me an 11. So I carry over the 1, and then I write down the 1 over here. Then I add up 2 and 1 to give me a 3, and then add that to 6 to give me a 9. And then I do 5 plus 1 to give me a 6. So my answer to 1, 2, 3, 4 plus 5, 6, 7, 8 is equal to 6, 9, 1, 2. Let's say I have something such as 2, 1, 8 minus 1, 2, 9. In this case, since 8 minus 9 will give me a negative number, I need to add 10 over here to give me 18. Take 1 away from the 1 to give me a 0. And then I have 18 minus 9 to give me a 9. 0 minus 2 will give me a negative number, so I need to add 10 to it to give me a 10. Take 1 away from the 2 to give me a 1. And now I have 10 minus 2 to give me an 8. And 1 minus 1 to give me a 0. So my answer to 218 minus 129 is equal to 89. So now let's do a few examples where we actually add and subtract numbers involving a decimal. Now, whenever you're adding and subtracting decimals with one another, the best thing to do is to completely ignore the decimal. So what do I mean by this? Well, let me just do an example so that you have a better understanding of it. So let's say I had something such as 2.36 plus 4.12. Now, if I want to find the answer to the sum of 2.36 and 4.12, all I really need to do is write the numbers on top of one another and align the columns properly. So I write it as 2.36 plus 4.12. Similar to adding integers, I put all the hundredths number on top of one another, all the tenths number on top of the another, the decimal points on top of one another, and all the units numbers on top of one another. Now the next thing that you can do, or basically what I like to do, is that I completely get rid of the decimal points in the beginning. So I write 2.36 and 4.12 like this over here. All I do then is I simply add the numbers together. So 6 plus 2 will give me an 8, 3 plus 1 will give me a 4, and 2 plus 4 will give me a 6. Now the next thing that I do is I figure out how many numbers after the decimals there were in the original problem. In this case, on the term 2.36, I had two numbers after the decimal point. Similarly, in the term 4.12, I had two numbers, 1 and 2, after the decimal point. Now I picked the term with the most number of numbers after the decimal point. Since both of these terms, 2.36 and 4.12, had two numbers after the decimal point, so let's just say that I picked the term 4.12. So then I know that my final answer will also have two numbers after the decimal point. So all I really need to do now is start from my right hand side and then count two numbers and then put a decimal point between the second and the third number like this over here. So my final answer to 2.36 plus 4.12 is 6.48. Now in this problem, I know that my final answer will have four numbers after the decimal point because in my original problem, the term with the most number of numbers after the decimal point is 1.8426, which has four numbers after the decimal point. What I can do now is that I know that on the top term I have 4 numbers, but I only have 3 numbers after the decimal point in the second term. So all that I really need to do is put a 0 in the end so that I have 4 numbers after the decimal point on the second term as well. Now I cannot add any number that I want. I can only put zeros after the last term on the decimal number so that it doesn't change its value. Similarly, on the third term, I only have 2 numbers. So what I can do is that I can add 2 zeros after the end. So no matter how many zeros I add after the last number, after the decimal point, it does not change the value of that term. So next I can rewrite all of these numbers over here, like this over here, without the decimal point. Next, I need to add them. So 6 plus 0 gives me a 6. 2 plus 6 plus 0 gives me an 8. 4 plus 8 gives me a 20. 8 plus 2 gives me a 10. Plus 1 gives me an 11. Plus 9 gives me a 20. Then 2 plus 1 gives me a 3. 3 plus 3 gives me a 6. And 6 plus 2 gives me an 8. And since we figured out in the beginning of the problem that I will have 4 numbers after the decimal point, I need to put a decimal point in such a way in the final answer so that I have 4 numbers after the decimal point. So I'll put a dot right between the 8 and the 0. So my final answer to 2.98 plus 3.186 plus 1.8426 is 8.0086. Now, pretty much the same set of procedure applies to when it comes to subtracting decimals. So in this example, if I have something such as 8.267 minus 3.482, the first thing that I can do is figure out how many number of numbers I will have in my final answer after the decimal point. In this case, this term over here has 3 numbers after the decimal point, and in this term over here, it also has 3 numbers after the decimal point. So my final answer will have 3 numbers after the decimal point. Now I can pretty much get rid of this decimal point over here and rewrite this as 8267 minus 3482. Now I can do the correct setup of this over here, like this over here. Next, I can do 7 minus 2 to give me a 5. 6 minus 8 will give me a negative number. So I need to add a 10 to 6 to give me a 16 and take 1 away from the 2 to give me a 1. So 16 minus 8 will give me an 8. And since 1 minus 4 will again give me a negative number, I need to add 10 to the 1 to give me an 11 and take 1 away from the 8 to give me a 7. So I'll have 11 minus 4, which will give me a 7, and 7 minus 3, which will give me a 4. So all there is left for me to do now is to put a decimal point in the right place. Since we figured out in the beginning of this problem that my final answer will have 3 numbers after the decimal point, I need to put a dot right over here between the 4 and the 7. So my final answer to 8.267 minus 3.482 is simply 4.785. Let's say you have 451.207 minus 261.189. What you can do first is figure out how many numbers you will have after decimal point in your final answer. So the highest number of numbers after the decimal point in the original problem is 3. So my final answer will have 3 numbers after the decimal point. Now I can ignore the decimal point and set up this subtraction problem like this over here. Now I can do 7 minus 9, but that will give me a negative number. So I need to add 10 over here to give me a 17 and take 1 away from here. But when I take 1 away from a 0, that also gives me a negative number. So I put a 9 on top over here. And since this 9 came from borrowing something from the number 2, I need to put a 1 over here because I took 1 away from the number 2 to give me a 1. So 17 minus 9 will give me an 8. 9 minus 8 will give me a 1. 1 minus 1 will give me a 0. 1 minus 1 again will give me a 0. 5 minus 6 will give me a negative number, so I add 10 to it. and take 1 away from the 4 to give me a 3. So 15 minus 6 will give me a 9, and 3 minus 2 will give me a 1. Now we figured out that in my final answer, I will have 3 numbers after the decimal point. So I need to put the decimal point right between these two zeros. So my final answer to 451.207 minus 261.189 is equal to 190.018. So let's say in this example you have 13.219 minus 11.38. The first thing that you can do is figure out how many number of numbers after the decimal point you will have in your final answer. This first term over here has 3 numbers after the decimal point. This second term over here has 2 numbers after the decimal point. We will have 3 numbers after the decimal point in the final answer. So I can set this problem up like this over here. For simplicity's sake, let's add one more term, or basically the number 0, after the number 8, so that we have 3 numbers on the top term and on the bottom term after the decimal point. Now let's write this problem over here without any decimals. So all that I need to do now is subtract the numbers. So 9 minus 0 will simply give me a 9. 1 minus 8 will give me a negative number. So I need to add 10 to it to give me 11. And take 1 away from the 2 to give me a 1. So 11 minus 8 will give me a 3. 1 minus 3 will give me a negative number, so I need to add 10 to it to give me 11, and take 1 away from the 3 to give me a 2. So 11 minus 3 will give me an 8, 2 minus 1 will give me a 1, and 1 minus 1 will give me a 0. Now since we figured out in the beginning of this problem that my final answer will have 3 numbers after the decimal point, I need to put a decimal point right between the 1 and the 8 to make that happen. So my final answer to 13.219 minus 11.38 is equal to 1.839. So that's it for this video. I hope you keep on working hard, and I'll see you in the next video when we go over how to multiply and divide decimals.